be prepared by knowing the audience, right? Knowing the podcast, knowing who they're talking to, know the room. You got to treat it like you're standing up in front of 100 or 10,000 people within a room.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster, it's your host, Adam Adams, and we are going to be talking to someone who's got not just his own podcast, but he also has a collective of other podcasts, and they're all within a space. So some of the things that we might get into is if you want to start your own podcast network, how you're going to do that, how you're going to niche down, if you should niche down. We might also talk a little bit about health and fitness because Eric and I are both very passionate about that subject. So there might be just a couple things that you learn along the way there. And then we want to talk about how he's been publishing his podcast, how often he's been publishing his podcast, because he's doing something a little bit unique. So this is Eric Malzone, and he has got a podcast called The Future of Fitness. His website is already down in the show notes for you. Also, the link to his podcast is in the show notes, and any social media, you can connect with him down in the show notes already. So you can scroll down and connect with Eric anytime. Eric, I've got a question. Did you start podcasting first or did you start your collective first? What order did you put those in?
Oh, the podcast came way before.
Okay.
And thank you for having me on, by the way, too, Adam. Really appreciate it. I started it. This is my 8th year now of recording. So I started it a couple months after I sold my gyms back in 2017. Because I didn't really know what I wanted to do next. So I'm like, well, I'll just start to interview some people. And I had worked at radio stations back in the day, so I was always mesmerized by the medium. I just started interviewing some friends, then started interviewing some mentors, and started interviewing other people, and then I just never stopped. So that's about.
Well, when you started with your podcast, was it always the same podcast, same name? You never rebranded it?
No, it was The Future of Fitness the whole time. And the goal was always, for the Gretzky quote, to help the industry skate to where the puck was going when it comes to health sciences, technologies, things like that. And it was really just selfishly, I curiously wanted to know because I didn't know what I was going to do within the industry next. So thought I'd ask a bunch of people smarter than me and see what they said.
So are you a fitness coach then as well?
I haven't done fitness coaching in quite some time, but I've coached thousands of people. I kind of hung that up a couple of years after I sold my gyms. I maintained some clients remotely. But I owned a CrossFit gym in Santa Barbara, California. And I also owned kind of a hybrid style personal training CrossFit gym in Ventura. So throughout that time, I've had the opportunity to coach thousands of people that came through those doors over the 8 years.
Yeah. And your collective, would you talk a little bit about where that idea came from? You already had your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You've had your podcast now for about 8-ish years as we record.
Yep.
When did you decide, hey, I'm going to start a whole group of people in my same field?
Yeah. So you've probably experienced this too, Adam, but I also had another podcast. I had the Fitness Blitz Radio, which was a daily podcast, which I did for about 2.5 years. And then I also co-host Athletech Unscripted, and then which is Athletech's kind of like the Bloomberg of fitness and wellness. And then I'm also this quarter launching a series, a special short series on that one. So I've done a lot. The Future of Fitness is definitely kind of my baby, my flagship podcast, but I've been ventured out in a lot of different things. I also had the Black Diamond podcast. Forgot about that. The collective started because of a couple things. Like I've built this massive network. I've interviewed over 800 people within the fitness and wellness industry. And got to know a lot of people and made a lot of friends through that journey. As a lot of podcasters know, it's a great way to build relationships and meet people and firm up relationships too. So I was looking for a way that I could start to leverage that network and monetize it. And really had a business coach, Pat Rigsby, who just told me, he's like, Eric, it's quite obvious, isn't it? I'm like, not to me, dude. Like, you don't tell me what is so obvious. He's like, well, you can have a placement agency. I'm like, well, yeah. I can. And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, man, I've been pitched. I don't know about you, Adam, but I get pitched probably 3 to 10 times a week, right? For a guest to be on the show. And most of it is shit. Like, I'll just say it, it's just bad. It's annoying to the podcaster. You can tell they haven't done any research. It looks bad for their client. There's a couple times I go through like stories that blew my mind of what some of these people will do. So to me, I was like, you know what? Yeah, I can do that. And I know it's not that much harder to do it better. And then I can do it specific to my industry, because one of the things that we look at is like, I understand for most of the podcasters that we work with, I know why they do a podcast, right? If it's just someone who just listens and consumes, may not understand like what's the motivation of the podcaster. Are they, looking to just build audience? Are they trying to generate leads for their business? Is it for business development? What are they looking to do? What is the business that they have that funds the podcast, right? So I was able to get really good insights. So we become essentially the industry's go-to placement agency for business development when it comes to media placement, so earned media. So that's kind of the main driver of the collective. And then the other side, I have this kind of, I guess, dream vision of how I believe fitness, health, and wellness podcasts, independent people like myself, who just do it because they like it or have a small business that drives the podcast, we can do, if we get together, we can leverage a lot of things, right? As an independent network. I don't know if you ski or not. I know you live in Denver, Colorado, but they have the Indy Pass, right? For skiing, which is like all these little independent resorts. You can get a pass that's either a discount or access to these passes. I'm like, that's a really cool idea. Like, they maintain the culture and the independence and vibe of an independent ski resort, but maybe they can also collaborate and do bigger things if they just leverage that community for like discounts on specific things or marketing budgets or sponsorships, things like that. So that's what we're trying to build on that side of it. But we're really just building value for them first through education. I do get a lot of sponsorship opportunities that cross my desk, so I pass that on to the community without a fee. So that's kind of the grand goal. And then the other thing that we're doing now, which I know isn't new to anybody, but I just get asked to do it all the time, is help launch a podcast. So we're doing that as well.
And I want to kind of move into all of creating the collective here in a sec.
Yeah.
But as far as helping people launch podcasts and within the collective, is it focused on health and fitness industry? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So everybody in there is maybe a fitness coach or something like that.
It's not necessarily, we get a couple fitness coaches. I'm talking to a guy who also has a business, but like a lot of our roster will be like a growing franchise like Metabolic. We have their executive, right? Okay. Their CEO who's on there. Fizmodo, a Sensei, Rook, who else? Push Press, these are all technology companies that do stuff like movement capture and motion recognition or wearable data integrations, things like that. So we have a very heavy lean into like fitness and wellness technologies that are looking for B2B or some B2C media that we can get them placed on. So that's kind of the core of what we do so far, but we're expanding.
So if I'm listening and I'm thinking about maybe creating my own collective or network of people in my industry, and for you, it helps you because you work in that industry. And so the more people that you can help them get placed on podcasts in their genre. And so that's how your business and podcasts, I think, are integrated. I'm curious if we are somebody who is listening and we're thinking about creating something like this, can we hear just your steps of how you did it, coupled in with if you would have done it differently now that you've learned a little bit things along the way?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think when you talk about building a community in any aspect, you really just have to figure out, I guess it's not rocket science, but it's just what value are you bringing to that community? And do they care? I think you and I know very well, like some of the biggest pains, like you're solving them, right? At growyourshow.com, like you're solving some problems, some very legitimate pains that podcasters have. And, within our collective of kind of building this community of podcasts, on one side, I saw that, I don't know if people recognize this if they're doing podcasts, but they will over time, is that it's not always easy to monetize a podcast. Right? It takes a little bit of time. It takes some creativity. It takes the right conversations, the right audience. There's a lot of different nuances that go into monetizing. But if you're ever getting people pitched to you on your podcast, there is someone making money off your podcast. It's not you. It's a placement agency. and or the PR agency. And I know that sounds super ironic because I run one now, but I just want to recognize that and be honest and say, like, yeah, I get paid to place people on your podcast, but in turn, I want to create as much value as I can through our collective and our community, so that I feel good about their two-way. You feel good about taking our guests and putting them on your podcast. So we're going to do that through like educating things on. We did a recent webinar on how to insert how to build your own GPT for your podcast, right? And through the steps of that, gave it away for free. Sometimes I get, like I mentioned, sponsors come to me like, hey, we're looking for a specific audience. I'm like, I'm not good for that, but here's 5 podcasts that I would recommend. So boom, they get that. We're building like a cohort of co-promotional things where it's like, you join a cohort and you have to post, every Tuesday at this time, and you're going to share the other podcasts that we're cross marketing organically. So, I think the biggest thing is, if you want to build a community of people, you have to be very clear on what is the commonalities between that community that you're trying to build. What is the value that you're presenting to them, and how desirable is the value that you want to present to them? Other than that, I know that sounds very high level, but I've built multiple communities over my career in person or digitally, and that really comes down to it, is you got to keep them engaged.
Now, are these communities, in your experience, more free communities, or are they paid communities? If I'm gonna have my own collective or network, should I be planning on charging? And if so, how much?
Yeah. I do not charge for this specific one. I had one that I was running for a while that was a Slack community. It was actually a little bit too early. I think if it was 3 years later, like during the pandemic, it probably would have boomed. But that one was paid, and I had to be. Here's the thing: is like, if people are paying, expectations are different, right? If I'm paying for a service, I expect, right, that I'm going to get a certain level of service, and you have to be able to sustain that. And like in that community that I had, it was a bunch of entrepreneurs within our space, and I had to deliver them a certain amount of introductions to our network every month, right? And I had to do a certain amount. I had to create value constantly. If you're not paying, or if people aren't paying, then the expectations may not be as high. So you have a little less pressure on what you want to do. So, I think it really depends on what the value is. But I'm going to tell you, building a community of engaged people, I think in any particular industry, you really have to have a very strong value proposition for them. And they have to be connected in a very specific way, because podcasters, if I sit down next to a podcaster, like, I'm already loving our conversation because you get it, right? You understand what it means to publish and try to do all these things. Like, that connection is very powerful because we both love it. Same when I was a gym owner. Like, if I talked to other gym owners, it was some kind of a bond that I had with them because we understood each other in a way that, like, couldn't go home and talk to my wife about my gym ownership problems, right? She was tired of it. But you see what I'm saying? It's like this commonality of challenges that can build a community really strongly, as long as you speak openly about those challenges and address them and address solutions for those challenges.
If we're starting a community and we're going to probably need to pitch people. I assume you pitch people. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you go about doing that, especially in the beginning when you're like, I have nobody. Would you like to join? How do you go about that?
Yeah. I think it's just, for me, it was always just a 15-minute, 20-minute conversation. I'm like, I got nothing right now. This is what I want to do. I would love it if you opted in. Here's the vision. And, at no point do you feel committed to this. And we didn't ask for much. All we asked for was essentially like, hey, we want to put you up on our website as a community member. We're going to directly link to your site. We're going to write a LinkedIn post about you. And then we want permission, right, for us to send you pitches for guests every once in a while. And I'm like, if that's not cool, totally understand. I just want to set expectations for this as is. Now, where do I want to see this in like a year or two? This is what I want, right? And that's where the direction we're heading. So just setting expectations for all this stuff. And, I've been around the business world long enough that I just cut straight to it and be like, hey, I'm not trying to sell you anything that I don't have. Here's what I want to do.
And what about niching? Should we think about niching like you have? To me, it resonates with me. I like that everybody's in the same category because it feels like everybody's getting some value and you can know your people really well. and I'm not trying to answer the question for you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking through it. If the listener is thinking about creating one, I've seen a lot of podcast communities or networks that have absolutely zero commonality. And so you've done the opposite. How should we look at it if we're listening?
Well, I haven't tried it any other way, Adam. So obviously I see a ton of value in sticking to my lane. We do, the core of our business, our service offerings we're a podcast placement agency specific to fitness, health, and wellness. And we could even say that B2B fitness, health, and wellness media, right? And that clearly defines what we do. People come to us, they understand that we're the specialists in that. And I happen to have found a niche that's growing really fast. And that I happen to know from the last 17 years of my involvement in it. So, I think it's so case by case and so nuanced to answer that. But yeah, I think having a niche is super valuable as long as you really understand that niche, and you understand the problems and you can really commit to it, because it's really easy, as you know, to start to, like we even had a client who's really wanted to get into pharma, right? They want to get into the pharma industry and pharma podcasts. And that was a world that we didn't know well. And we gave it a good go. We saw some mild success. The client didn't stick around, and just cut straight to the end of the story here. But because we went a little outside the lane, but I learned a lot. Like, okay, the pharma industry media is very different. Like, they want money. You want to get on their podcast, they want 15 grand, right? I'm like, holy cow, that is not the way that the wellness and fitness industry works. Like, most of these people don't charge to be on a podcast, right? So it was very eye-opening. It was very different types of people. So I don't regret going down that path, but it was a really learning experience to be like, hey, we can continue to grow within our niche. There's plenty of room to grow there still.
Should we be thinking about getting on other people's podcasts in any industry? And if so, would working with somebody like you, but maybe if the listener has a different podcast, it's not in the health space or anything like that.
Yeah.
How do we find the right person to pay money to so that they can get us booked?
Yeah. I think you get what you pay for, just like anything within the service world. Do you want to get on any podcast? I mean, that's tough. There's some that can have definitely maybe a negative effect, right? If it's not done well, doesn't portray you or your brand the way you want it to. I mean, ultimately, if you're on an interview, it's up to you how you represent yourself. But I think if you're just getting started, right? If you just want to start to hit the podcast circuit, I would take a bunch of them, mainly just for repetition. Like, you may be good at interviewing people. You may be great at recording your own podcast and publishing good content, but being interviewed is a skill, right? Just like interviewing is a skill. So like getting repetitions, and like I was telling someone the other day, like the worst case scenario is that, maybe the interview doesn't go so well, but at least you have some content that someone else developed for you at no charge, right? So yeah, but
with you are a good guest. You work well with being a guest. You answer naturally, and you are talking about being prepared going into this. And that's part of why I'm starting off the question this way.
Yeah,
it's because there's so many people that are on my podcast, and I'll just listen to practically anybody's podcast, and it is the same. There's so many people that I think they got coached how to, really do their interview side, like being interviewee side. And it kind of feels like a sales pitch the whole time. And it feels so scripted that it's hard to feel like it's authentic. And I'm curious what you would share with the listener when you're talking about, being interviewed is a skill. You should be able to do it. And it sounded like you also said to be prepared on that side.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of thoughts, but is there like too much preparing, or what do you think is really good advice for somebody who's going to be getting interviewed on multiple podcasts I get so much because many people seem to like want to push something, and it's hard to do that and sound authentic and natural.
Yeah. It's a very powerful question. And we could do a whole hour on this because I think it's really important. And I don't like interviewing on my podcast anyone from marketing, a CMO, whatever, agencies, stuff like that. You know why? Because it just turns into the same marketing talking points about their value proposition and blah, blah, blah. doesn't interest me personally. When we started the podcast collective, one of the other reasons I want to do it because I've had so many what I thought should be amazing guests with great stories, but I could tell they just weren't well prepared. And one of the things that irks me is if I ask people like, "Hey, where do you want people to go? What do you want people to do next?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know. I guess you could go check me out on Instagram at doodoggy94. I like that." And I'm like, dude, you missed out on a huge opportunity. So anyway, to get back to your question, we do a lot of preparation. We do a lot of media kits. We do a lot of things that we want to make sure that everything is polished and as well prepared as they can be going into an interview so that's optimized to the fullest. Directly answer your question. Everyone's different. Some people talk too much. Some people don't talk enough. Some people have a fear of being authentic, right? I think if anything, if I was going to give people advice, would be like, be prepared by knowing the audience, right? Knowing the podcast, knowing who they're talking to, know the room. Like you got to treat it like you're standing up in front of 100 or 10,000 people within a room, because it's a digital stage. So just know the audience, know what their value points are, what they want, what they're probably interested in. See the type of content that the podcasters put out. If you can, listen to how they do it, their vibe, the kind of, pacing, things like that. And then be authentic, right? Some of the best coaching value we provided is to people who are maybe a little scared of telling a personal story. Dan Weimer is the CEO of Push Press. It's a $100 million company. He built it over 11 years. He told me his backstory once about how right when he was starting the business, he hit rock bottom, and it was nasty. It was like drug addiction, felony charges, losing, his getting kicked out of his household, losing his gym business because his partners kicked him out. Like, it was terrible. And then he had that opportunity, right? Like, someone sat him down. As he was walking in line to get into the bus to go to a hardcore jail in California, his parents finally decided to bail him out. And then his friend said, "Sit down." No one was going to give him a job. Just sit down and start writing this code for this software program. And then he turned it around, right? And he just worked and worked and worked. He's still, 10, 11 years later, completely clean. And that's the type of story that I know people remember. And it took me a little bit to get him to do it, but he tells it often, and people remember it. People resonate with that. And they're thinking like, not only is, okay, well, that's awesome. I really like Dan. I wonder what this push press software thing is, right? Like, I'm curious about that too. So I think being authentic and then being a storyteller versus like, a sales points deliverer is really big. Like, if you have a product or something, or, a solution that you're providing, instead of telling us percentages about everything it's done for businesses, like, tell me how it helped Adam. Like, tell me a story about your client, praise the client. So I think that's the biggest thing, is being prepared by knowing the audience, be authentic, be a storyteller, and then obviously having a good kind of closing at the end too, that you want people to really engage with.
By closing, do you mean call to action?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty universal term for it. Yeah, okay. Something that you want people to do.
How do we think through that? Can we talk about your call to action, or can we coach on my call to action, or how would we be able to share with the listener how to be thinking about how to close?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to the first part too. Adam is like, well, know the audience of the specific podcast, right? Like, obviously your podcast is about podcasting. It's right in the name. So, what I would want is I'd want people to simply just follow me on LinkedIn. Because we put a lot of good content out there. That's where you get an idea of where our webinars are. That's a great place to do it. But I think it really depends on who it is. For Dan, go back to his, because he's a really good example. He's mostly wants to get out in front of gym owners, investors, other entrepreneurs. Like, he's trying to step up now into a very high echelon of types of guests or types of podcasts that he's on. We just have a really simple place. We develop pushpress.com/Dan. So that if I'm a listener, I'm driving, I'm doing my laundry, I'm working out, I can remember pushpress.com/Dan, right? And from there, it has a lot of different things. It has this email newsletter that he has. It has some speaking that he's done before, ways to contact him. So we developed a really simple place. Be like, hey, just push people to this at the end of every interview. So I think that's really nice. And I think, as you know, with people listen to podcasts may not have the ability to write something down or go type in a URL, right? Or go to their social media right away. So having something that's memorable, from listening standpoint is a really powerful thing too. But, once again, it depends on what you do, what the goal is of you being on that podcast, who the audience is you're talking to, and what specific action you'd want them to take.
Yeah. I've done a lot of interviews on people's entrepreneurship type podcasts for the podcast on podcasting. So we'll talk about who knows what. There's usually 3 or 4 topics that are underneath entrepreneurship, but in a way they can tie into podcasting and your authority, building your authority in your space. And I want you to coach the coach, because I'm a podcast coach. I want you to coach the coach real fast. And hopefully the listener will get something out of it. When I go on these entrepreneurship different podcasts and they ask me, how does the listener find you? Or is there anything you want to share like that? I usually have 2 different CTAs. And if I'm coaching other people, I say have 1 and a max of 2. And then I go and have 2. So I want to share you my pitch and you tell me what you do to change it. Or if it's perfect, that would be fine too. People will just say, hey, how do people find you, Adam? I say, well, hey, if they're wanting more free content just like this, the podcast on podcasting is really easy to find. They're already on this platform. They could just go over and check me out. Everything's for free. If they're ready to work with me, they want to find out more about that, then they could go to growyourshow.com, and in the top right corner, there's a button to connect with me, and we can have a discovery call and see if we can help you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really good overall. The only suggestion, and, because that's boring if I say, hey, great job, let's move on, right? But I think if I was going to make one suggestion, was it have a singular place.
A singular place
to go. I think there's a lot of things, like I'm sure there's something that drives your entire business, whether it's your email list or your social, that leads to the websites, right? But that one thing that if you're building it, most people, it's an email list. Like we're sitting here in 2025 and email is still king, right? It's shocking to some point, because I remember sending my first email in like 1996. That's still so relevant, right? So I think if I was going to coach that up, I think it's excellent. I probably want to change much, but if you had one singular place that you want people to go, most of the time I drive people to my LinkedIn. I'm like, hey, I would love to connect you with you on LinkedIn. So just go there. That's what I do most of the time. Because then from there, if like people start following me and they start seeing my content, they'll start to get an idea how it has links on my profile to all my different websites and what I do. But it's kind of an aggregate of all things. I used to have ericmalzone.com, but I took it down for revamped it and I never revamped it. But that's a great place too, right? I think is, if you have, adamadams.com, something like that aggregates everything you do, would be a really cool thing as well.
Cool. Adamadams.com was too expensive, so I got fun stuff. I want to, after the break, I want to talk a little bit more about email lists, building an email list, since you mentioned how successful that can be. And prior to that, I want to cover what you mentioned earlier about being on somebody's podcast. And then I've got 2 random questions.
Sure.
Take a break and then go to the email list. So I really liked that you talked about prepping to be optimized on interviews. The call to action, having something set and ready to go that was singular, was a big takeaway. Doing the recon on the host and the show was very valuable. Understanding that you have to know who the audience is of that show so that you can really speak to them. And then you talked about using your personal story, and I loved the example that you used. Furthermore, using client stories. So being a storyteller instead of like trying to talk people into buying this thing was very valuable. So if you're listening and you're thinking, hey, I'm going to be starting to get on to a couple people's podcasts, consider identifying and perfecting your personal story. Be vulnerable, like Eric said, and also any client stories if that's the case for you. If you've got a couple of people that you've worked with. You also mentioned about talking too much or talking too little. So my notes say the Goldilocks talking just right. Yeah. And finally, one of the big takeaways was just to be authentic, that authenticity. So now I've got 2 random questions that I don't know how impactful they're going to be for the listener or not. You owned a CrossFit gym. You sold it several years ago. You moved to Montana. Do you still do CrossFit today, or do you do a different type of workout?
Yeah, I do not do CrossFit anymore. I did it pretty hard for about 9 years, and to tie this into a story, I had Anders Varner on my podcast recently, who's one of the original guys from Barbell Shrug. Which, if you're in the CrossFit space, Barbell Shrug is like the paramount ideal for podcasting, right? Like they started it all, and their audience is huge, and we joked like for every like 3 years you're consistently training hard at CrossFit. Once you're done, you need 1 year to recuperate. So I think it's about accurate. Like I did about 9 years. It took about 3 years for my body to kind of heal and feel good. And I don't want to go back to that training. I'm 48 years old now, and I just I just know myself. My mind would be like, you can still do it, right? And then my body would be like, hit the brakes, buddy. So I do more, very consistent kind of strength training. And then now I live in Montana. It's like almost all of my conditioning is done outdoors relative to the season.
I love that. Secondarily, you mentioned that most of your clients are business to business.
Mm-hmm.
You're also in the field. And I'm curious, this comes because one of the blood work providers that I've been working with for my clients that do health and fitness.
Yeah.
They changed everything. They got rid of discounts. You have to have a membership with them, and the prices got raised as well. So I'm looking for another blood work provider. I know a couple of decent ones, but I'm curious if you've come across anybody that does a great job for a great price at looking at our biomarkers.
Well, great price is relative. The one that I've been testing it out, and I've been talking to these guys quite a bit, is Vitality Blueprint. This is Dr. Andy Galpin and Dan Garner's one. And what I like about it is that they're essentially taking Dan Garner's mind and Andy Galpin's mind and trying to put it into an algorithm. So you get all the blood work done. It's super comprehensive. I think it's over 1,000 biomarkers, but then they make very distinct recommendations within lifestyle, nutrition, and supplementation. And it took me a while to get into and kind of get used to what their platform is doing, but I really like it. And now they're building out something more for practitioners where you can do that, right? Maybe earn a commission and as well get a dashboard for the clients. So they're seeing that solution. And what I like about that, and then for the industry folks, so for practitioners, coaches, trainers, is that it removes a lot of the scope of practice issues that you would have as a trainer. So what I mean by that for people who are listening, scope of practice is like, if you're not a licensed nutritionist or someone with a medical degree, it doesn't matter. You can still use that as a platform to get all the value, a lot of the value you would out of like a partnership with a medical professional or a registered dietitian. And you can kind of skirt around that and still deliver a ton of value to your clients. So I think that's an excellent one. Obviously, those guys are smart as hell. They've been doing this for a very long time. So I think that's a good one to look at.
Cool. I wrote down Vitality Blueprint. Thank you.
Yeah,
we'll take a quick break. I want to learn about email lists, and I think that's going to help the listener too. We'll be right back.
Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, GrowYourShow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. We're back with Eric Malzone. We've learned a lot of cool things so far. He's from the Future of Fitness podcast, which that link and his website link is down in the show notes, and probably his LinkedIn is down in the show notes too. So you can scroll down and connect with him.
Awesome.
I wanted to find out, Eric, you did mention that bring people to your LinkedIn, but one of the smart places that a lot of us could bring people at the end of a podcast might be a way to get them on our email list. You said in 2025, people are still reading emails. How about I just turn it over to you and we can talk a little bit about email lists, building email lists, and just some things that we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah. It's crazy how long email has been such a strong asset. When I started my first gym in '08, we immediately started grabbing emails, right? And that became a huge source of new clients, and we just consistently hit with value. I don't think I need to go into like email marketing 101. It's creating value, not pitching all the time, right? But really knowing who your avatar is and how you create value for them on a consistent basis. And, I think as far as building an email list, I'm not going to sit here and say, here's the one secret. All I'm going to say is that it has to be constantly on your mind, right? Like every single guest you have on your podcast should feed into your email list, right? You should be doing webinars periodically. You should be considering buying lists or going to events and buying lists. You should be collecting emails like it's your job. And I'm super guilty of this because I'll forget. Like I'll go months at a time, like, oh, I haven't added a single one of my guests to my email list, and I have to go back and do it manually. So, if you can build in automations for all this stuff, I think that's really critical. But there's numerous ways to build your email list. And even if it's just as simple as, I do something in my podcast where I offered a 2024 AI guide, right, to the industry. Like, hey, I interviewed 5 experts. And the nice thing about podcasting is you could probably take something within your already built content library, maybe pick a series or some kind of thing like that, take it, have it transcribed, put it into an ebook, boom, within, a day or two, you have a nice downloadable guide that you can get collecting people's emails for. So for me, it was like, well, I interviewed 5 people in 2024 about artificial intelligence and its effect on our industry. So I'm going to take those, summarize them, put them in a GPT, send it over to someone to create an ebook, and then I'm going to put it up on my website as a free download. I'm going to promote it during my interview. So it can be as simple as that, but you just have to be in the mindset of all the time. Like you go to an event, you meet someone, cool. Hey, can I get your email? Right? Follow up, put them on your email list. And if they don't like it, that's fine. They can unsubscribe. It's not that big of a deal anymore. I don't know if that's even legal, what I just suggested, but
I don't know if it is, but I'm not faulting you for it at all. Yeah. I've gotten on so many people's emails, and I hate reading email anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm dyslexic, so I hate reading anything. Oh. A stop sign's going to bother me, I'm sure. At any rate, so I've got a couple of things that came from you, and building an email list.
Well, you're an excellent listener.
I try. Thank you. Tell that to my girlfriend, right? All right. Webinars are one way that we can grow an email list. I had a question on that. How frequently is this webinar Eric webinar, and how frequently is this webinar collaborative with somebody else, maybe who was on the show? Yeah.
I would say probably 80-20, 80 being collaborative, 20 being just Eric.
Okay.
Because, just like podcasting or anything else, when you bring other people in, you're also now engaging their audience if they have one, and then attracting that audience. So I think that's really critical. Is how do you leverage other people's audiences to build your own?
I have to share a quick brief story. I had a meetup group, and it did end up being one of the biggest meetup groups in the world, honestly, but the biggest one in Colorado. We saw 8,000 faces a year, wow. And the second one in that area they barely even see 200. So 8,000 versus 200. We were very huge until COVID. You mentioned something that illustrates it's an important thing that really is a takeaway for the listener. And I noticed it work in my meetup group. And that was the collabs. And you mentioned 80-20, so 80% of the time having somebody else joining you on that, because you can grab their audience. And I remember, I don't know how I got this. I just kind of made it up back then. But when I wanted to grow my meetup, I would go to all of the other meetup organizers in my area that had the biggest following in what I wanted them to follow me. And I'd have them speak on something alone, or I got creative and had like a panel of like the top people in the. And what ended up happening is my meetup grew crazy rapidly fast. And it was because I kept like capturing the followers of these other meetup groups that already had followers. So I love that you said that. And I definitely wanted to touch on it a little bit more. You mentioned automations. What kind of automation might be something that we're like, hey, if I only did that, or if I had to keep it simple, where would I start with automation?
Yeah. If we're talking about just in reference to building your email list, I think something that's super stupid simple is if you have a scheduling link for people to book your podcast, that when they schedule, that automation puts their email into your list. Brilliant. Or even just a list of potential guests. Because now once you get to, what are you at, over 500 episodes now?
You're like 502 or something.
Or no, I think I don't know. I'm enough, like 450 or something on the future of fitness. So think about that. Like, yeah, it's 7 years.
What I meant is you might be published on my show as around 502.
Got it.
I was just throwing out, like, I don't know what the number is right now, but it's a couple above 5.
I would have really liked to have been 500, Adam. That would have been really cool. But
I think it comes out tomorrow already, and my team would be so pissed if I changed it.
Well, we were just met, so maybe I could be 1,000.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Baby steps.
But just something like that. So like every time you have someone as a guest on the show, they book that automatically, that automation puts them into an email list of your guests. Now, if you get to Adam's stature and you have 500, now you have an email list of 500, right? Which is not a bad starting point, especially if you know all these people that have a relationship with you. You kind of know what they're looking for, right? These are all people who have podcasts or in the podcast space. Now you have a nice list of 500 people, Adam, that you can serve up value and maybe, additional services, things like that. So even something simple, that scheduling link that puts people into your email list.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
Cool. Easy peasy. I've got a friend who always says easy peasy lemon squeezy. It starts to drive me nuts, but I love the guy too much. You also mentioned value, and I don't remember how you worded it, but it was something to the effect of, you will have an ask or a call to action, but it's mostly value. Would you mind kind of going over that a little bit more deeply?
Yeah. When I think of value, I think about offering value first. So before you ever ask for anything, be a person of value, right? And I get that, like, the book, The Go-Giver, I don't know if people have read that, but Bob Burg, it's one of the most gifted books for me personally, that and Who Moved My Cheese. Like, they're just parables, right? Little books. But in that, it's really just talks about, like, be a person of value, always look to understand what people need and help them. Expect nothing in return, right? Because as the universe works, it'll come back. And I've been a very difficult person to actually get to believe that. Like, I've had a really hard time to believing it, but I've seen it and it works. So I think that's it's more of a mindset than a distinct like tactic. Is like, how do you always lead with value first before you ever ask for anything? Like, I get on podcasts and I'm immediately being sold right after, right? And it just doesn't, like, oh, that was you just use me. So maybe start with a little bit of value. Like,
oh, I shouldn't do that.
Well,
at the end of this episode,
but you're creating value also, in the other words, and this is like, I was contradictory when I'm saying, but you are providing value right away because you're giving me a platform, you're giving me a nice piece of content, right? So whether you know it or not, subconsciously, you are providing value to me first. So there's that. There's a lot of subconscious stuff that comes on with value. So anyway, I think that's it. It's more of a mindset than anything. Don't immediately straight for the throat to sell. Like, try to provide value. For me, whenever I have a guest on my show, the 5 minutes post recording is always magical. It's like, hey man, what do you need help with? Or I ask them during the interview, what's the biggest challenge you're facing right now? And if I can genuinely help with that, then I will. If it's a connection in my network, if it's something like, hey, you know what, 30 minutes, I think I have a solution for you, but let me talk to somebody first, right? I don't want anything in return. I want to be a person of value. And then that's remembered.
Let me share three other things that I remember you saying as far as building the email list, because I think they're also really good takeaways. I want to make sure that the listener has written them down. One is that you add every guest that you have to that email list, and you even think about that guest ahead of time, basically like, hey, how would I build this? The next one was having a free download. You talked about the end of 2024, you put together something. And it was quick, it was easy, and that can add to growing your email list. So I don't think it has to be overcomplicated for the listener who's putting together some type of free download. It sounds like it's easy enough. You use ChatGPT. You also taught some podcasters how to get their own GPT for podcasting. So good stuff. I think that was a great takeaway. And then the mindset always. So you said it's like always part of your mindset is your email list. You're thinking about it in multiple places. And I thought that was really valuable. You mentioned that you had a question for me as well. remind me your question here.
Yeah. So I was posed this question by Pete Moore when I was on his podcast, Halo Talks, and we were talking about podcasting as a medium, as a business, as kind of where it's at. And I think coming out of 2024, we saw that its effect on the US elections was undeniable, right? So some people say podcasting's maxed out. I say no. I think we're just on the upswing. So the question specifically was a baseball analogy. Like if you look at podcasting in the sphere of its dominance as a 9 innings, what inning do you think we're in right now when it comes to podcasting?
I think it would be tough to really know all the way, but just knowing the future and the capability, the of what's happening already with YouTube and who listens to podcasts, I would probably guess we're like only in the 3rd inning, where there has been a lot that has happened. We kind of understand maybe the trajectory of the game. Things could change, but we're in a good place. We've had some stuff solidly happen, but with approximately 5 million shows and a lot less than that are currently active today, and as many listeners as we have, and then when we compare it to who's listening, who's watching YouTube, for example, my thinking is that we have the capacity of having millions and millions more listeners than we even do now, and we have a ton. And my feeling is that there's already, I think it's 60 times the amount of YouTube channels as there are 5 million podcast channels, meaning I think we have room to grow 30, 60, or 100 times where we are as far as actual shows. So if you are somebody who's wanting to start a podcast, it's probably not too late.
I love it. I said the 4th inning when he asked me. So we're pretty close. And I just think when you look at transition from any major media, like when we went from radio to TV, right? TV to, streaming, I guess. And now where we're going with podcasting, and that type of what I would call authentic media, like independent media. I think we're very early on, and I think there's tons of room to grow. And I think it's just a really cool space. And like the talent is changing, right? Like whoever was a TV personality on a major media channel does not make a good podcast host, right? So we're seeing like that shift in how people consume and what their demands are. So I agree with you. I think we're still really early. So I think it's a great time to get involved.
I love that. So to the listener, go ahead and scroll down. You can connect with Eric Malzone. You can check his podcast out. You can check him out on LinkedIn or go to his website. The next episode is going to be queued up here in a second. So if you've got a sec, don't go anywhere. I'll see you on the next episode.
I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this, and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.